Hello, and welcome to Uncovering China's Coronavirus Agenda, an online briefing on the COVID-19 outbreak and how it has affected Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Chinese citizens. The COVID-19 pandemic now affects almost every imaginable part of our lives and currently dominates the news and our political discourse. Amid the blizzard of information and debate, we have gathered as a group to ensure that there is space for discussion about a worrying trend, the use of authoritarian measures in response to the virus. In this briefing, we will discuss China and its government, the Chinese Communist Party. The first victims of this pandemic, before it spread around the world, were Chinese citizens. And in the following weeks and months, doctors, whistleblowers, and critics of the government have been detained or otherwise silenced. Meanwhile, Tibetans and Uyghurs, who have been living under occupation for decades, are themselves facing new threats and repressive measures. Our panel today will address the harsh security and surveillance measures that have been imposed by the CCP and highlight the party's use of propaganda and diplomacy on the international stage. My name is John Jones. I'm the Campaigns and Advocacy Manager at Free Tibet in London, and I'll be chairing this discussion. The structure is as follows. Each member of the panel is going to begin with a brief opening statement on their area of expertise. After that, we will open up for questions from viewers. I'll make one thing clear from the outset. During these discussions, you will hear criticism, very robust criticism of the Chinese government and authorities. What you will not hear are attacks or generalizations about Chinese people who have themselves been affected by the pandemic. This will be reflected in the opening statements and also, I trust, in the questions to the panel. With that said, let me introduce the panel. So with us today, we have Dorji Setin, who's the Executive Director of Students for a Free Tibet, Kinzon Dongdu, who is Executive Director of the Australia Tibet Council, Lobsang Gyatso, Digital Security Program Director for Tibet Action Institute, Dr. Teng Biao, a Chinese human rights lawyer and scholar, Yachu Wang, who is a China researcher at Human Rights Watch, and Zumratai Arkin, who's Program and Advocacy Manager at the World Uyghur Congress. The first person that we're going to be hearing from an overview of the situation is Dr. Teng Biao.
Thank you very much. The outbreak of coronavirus and the way Chinese government handles it completely reflected China's governance failure. For example, Chinese government approved and organized the major events even after the spread of the epidemic, and its arbitrary confiscation of emergency supplies, arbitrary detention during the mass quarantine, the fake statistics, and internationally manipulating WHO, spreading conspiracy theories, exporting underqualified face masks and test kits, and using the export of medical equipment to pursue CCP's political agenda, so on and so on. But first and foremost, it's Chinese government cover up that made China and the world miss the best opportunity to prevent and control the coronavirus. The first case can be tracked back to November 17, 2019, and as early as December 27th, it was confirmed to be a novel coronavirus. Xi Jinping and top Chinese leaders had already known the seriousness of coronavirus in early January or even late December, but they decided to hide the information because of its own political consideration. The whistleblower, Dr. Li Wenliang, was summoned and administered by local police. Citizen journalists Chen Qiushi, Fang Bin, Li Zehua, Xu Ziyong, Guo Quan, Ivan, and many others who posted the truth or comments about the coronavirus through social media were all arrested, detained, or forcibly disappeared. CHRD has documented more than 900 cases involving Chinese internet users penalized by police for their online speech. Hong Kong journalists were detained and their footage deleted. Dozens of foreign reporters were expelled. In general, we have to realize that Chinese authorities escalated suppression online and social control. The COVID-19 is being used by the Chinese Communist Party as a chance to strengthen its high-tech totalitarianism. And CCP's suppression of freedom, the disinformation, the mismanagement have caused significant delay of emergency responses and loss of life, not only in China, but also all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Tong Biao. The next person to speak is Khin Sung Dong Tu from the Australia Tibet Council.
Thank you, John. It's so great to be together with colleagues and allies from across the world to discuss this very important issue. Now, if we look at the situation in Chinese occupied Tibet before the coronavirus, Tibetans were already living in a very repressive environment. Tibetans or the Tibet movement is all too familiar with whatever China is doing, whether it is the silencing of the critical voices or the draconian measures, that are infringing on the basic human rights, along with ramping up its propaganda machine. And as a result of which, Tibetans have always lived in a state of fear and anxiety. And so while the rest of the world is experiencing the current lockdown, as a result of this pandemic, Tibet under Chinese rule has actually been in a state of lockdown for many years. The Tibetan people are locked inside Tibet and the rest of the world can't get in. So, you will remember that earlier this year, Tibet has been rated as the second least free country in the world for the 5th time in a row, only next to Syria. Now, what is deeply troubling to see during this crisis is the further escalation of China's crackdown in Tibet. For instance, Tibetans who were sharing information about the crisis, or even, doing prayers to ward off the crisis, have been arrested or punished. So the danger now we are seeing right now is that these heavy-handed measures by China can be normalized and even worse still accepted. So our job is to ensure that the Chinese government, under the pretext of combating coronavirus, they do not intensify repression in Tibet or for that matter in other occupied territories in China. So these are unprecedented times for all of us. So I really hope that that when the world comes out of this crisis, we have a world which is not the same as today's world, a world which is a much more compassionate world, and also one which is more courageous, more honest with each other. And as this crisis has exposed how interdependent we are with each other, I hope that there is more empathy towards the suffering of other people, and ultimately we have to come out of this crisis making China accountable. I won't speak on this at this stage, but ultimately we can't basically go back to business with usual with China. So I'll end here.
Thank you, Khin Sung. Our next speaker is Zumratai Arkin from the World Uyghur Congress.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me in this great panel with great colleagues. So we, as my colleague mentioned it, we all are familiar with China's and Chinese Communist Party's repressive policies towards its own citizens, whether it is in occupied Tibet, whether it is in occupied East Turkestan or other parts of China. And since this crisis has begun, China has proven how they completely disregarded Uyghur lives by doing a couple of things, such as sending Uyghur doctors in Wuhan to dance for patients in Wuhan. And this is especially frustrating because the authorities regularly change their narratives on Uyghurs. Sometimes they will portray them as separatists, religious extremists, and sometimes they will portray them as docile content citizens, and they will often exoticize them. And so this is worrying because when Uyghurs and Kazakh cultures and other ethnic groups' cultures serves CCP's interests, then China will use it for damage control and pacifying public anger. And that was especially true during this coronavirus outbreak. And what's worrying in this this whole situation is the lack of information on the situation in East Turkestan. We've heard a lot about what was happening about the cases outside of in mainland China, except for East Turkestan and Tibet. And actually, this, according to Radio Free Asia, this any information relating to COVID-19 was treated as a state secret in China, in East Turkestan. I'm sorry. And what's also worrying is the situation inside the camp. So we know that since 2017, there's between 1 to 3 millions of Uyghurs and other Turkic ethnic minorities that are held in internment camps arbitrarily. And what's worrying is that we had absolutely no information since the outbreak on the situation inside these camps. Meanwhile, we know that there were 500 confirmed cases in different prisons in China and other provinces of China, and the situation, the sanitary conditions in the camps it's a breeding ground for spread of the virus. So this is all very worrying. So I think, like my colleague said, we have to be, after this crisis, we have to know that we need to hold China accountable for its many crimes, especially including their response to this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Zumrafai. Our next speaker is Yachu Wang. She's a China researcher at Human Rights Watch.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just gonna just follow up Dr. Tong Bell, and he talked about censorship, how the Chinese government tried to censor people who try to speak the truth and people who try to go to Wuhan to do independent reporting. So censorship has always been a big part of China's strategy to shape the narrative, which is to silence the people who criticize the government. On the other aspect is propaganda. So when the situation was still very bad and the Chinese government tries to, respond by massive quarantine, without regard of, people's access to medical care and other life necessities. During that time, the propaganda they're doing is they try to, emphasize the doctors and nurses' sacrifices. So it's all about, portraying people making great sacrifices for the country, and people, it's all in a very moving, sentimental way. So that's how the government tried to shape the narrative. You need to focus on the sentimental stories, don't criticize the government as a way to rally people together. After they try kind of control the situation, they start to propagate a narrative. All these draconian measures are necessary to contain the virus. Our terror system is superior at beating the virus. So that has been still going on. The government tried to say it's under the great leadership of Xi Jinping. Under great leadership of the wise and resolute Communist Party, we are beating the virus. So that has been going on. Then this narrative has been going on since they kind of control the situation. Another aspect of the whole shaping the narrative is the disinformation. The Chinese government has always been doing disinformation within the country, saying everything basically. When anybody who tried to challenge the government, it's because the U.S. government is behind them. So this time they say the U.S. Army brought, some diplomats on Twitter saying the U.S. Army brought the virus to China. What's interesting is that this time they're doing it on Twitter, which is blocked in China, which is I think it's their first time that they try to do this kind of disinformation outside of China. We'll see whether it works, because people in China bought the theory that the U.S. brought the virus, but that's because they don't have access to alternative news sources. But outside of China, people know they have access to alternative credible news media reporting. So I think it's actually backfiring, because people feel the Chinese government doing this kind of disinformation is reckless and dangerous and irresponsible. Everybody's talking about the WHO. The Chinese government has been influencing WHO for a long time, and now they're bearing fruit. The WHO from the very beginning has been praising the Chinese government for its great, its very swift, efficient response, and they're still doing that even given all the criticism going on. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Yachol. The next speaker is Lobsang Gyatso. He's Digital Security Program Director for the Tibet Action Institute.
Hi, thank you, John. I wanted to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, right? When I was looking at this, it kind of made me look at three systemic components of the Chinese government. The first, which was censorship, and I think Teng Bao and my other colleagues have touched on it in terms of how censorship has led to the spread of COVID-19, especially like what was censored online, whether it's on WeChat or YY. There was a number of reports by Citizen Lab. CDT did some reports on that. So I think that was pretty well highlighted. So that's one part of it. The second part for me is looking at the surveillance aspect of it, which is the rise of some of these contact tracing apps, which was used by China, and the implications are beyond this crisis for ordinary Chinese citizens. What are the implications? So I think that's another thing that I'm just looking at it. And also the fact that a number of other governments around the world have started to use that, whether kind of like looking at how do you stop this pandemic, right? But whether there are policies or whether there are mechanisms to protect individual freedom is a question that's beyond the scope of my research or my looking at this. And the third, I think Yakwai has already spoken a bit about it, is the disinformation campaign, right? Which was the US Army brought the virus to Wuhan, and then the Chinese spokesperson talked about it, tweeted on it. There's actually a really good Stanford research paper, which is entitled Coronavirus Conspiracy Claims, What's Behind the Chinese Diplomats' COVID-19 Misdirection. And this is actually just one of the disinformation, right? So while I was looking at these three different parts of it, kind of like I was thinking about all these three components have been in existence in China and used by the Chinese government for a number of years against Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Chinese dissidents. The only difference now is that we see these components have an impact that is beyond China and has a global impact. So I wanted to take a look at these and step back before the COVID-19 pandemic, right? The censorship aspect, which has already been like researched by a number of global researchers, and I think like what has changed is not about how the Chinese platforms have censored. Like that's one part of it, like WeChat censorship, YY censorship. How global tech companies are complicit in these things, such as the Apple's removal of the VPN apps, and the most recent one where they removed the encryption keyboard from a Chinese app store. So all these were done in the name of complying with local laws. In terms of surveillance, I don't think I need to reiterate any more than what my fellow panelists have already spoken about. However, I just wanted to ask this question. How will these apps, which are actually called Trojan horse by some human rights group, be used for a common Chinese citizen in the years to come, in the same way that it has been used for Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Chinese dissidents? So I think that's a question that we really need to ask. As for disinformation, yes, I think it's very true. Like people abroad are questioning, why was this disinformation? People don't believe in the fact that, oh, it's like the Chinese government like basically put out saying that the US brought the virus to China, right? However, I wanted to go back to 2008, in 2008, there was a peaceful Tibetan protest like all over Tibet. They were marked by a few sporadic violent outbursts, but it was largely peaceful. However, it is still referred to as the 2008 Tibetan Unrest, which is very, in some ways, it's not clear what it was. Was it a peaceful protest? Was it a violent protest? So, and if you look at the common Chinese citizens' viewpoints of it, the misinformation and the disinformation campaign that was run by the Chinese government has worked. People considered the 2008 protests inside Tibet as completely violent. I'm talking about a common Chinese citizen. However, if you look globally, it's still kind of like mirth in this, in some ways, a very politically correct word, which is the 2000 Tibetan unrest. Rather than saying it was a protest which was largely peaceful, maybe it's written somewhere down the line, but the whole phrase is always used as 2008 Tibetan unrest. So I think thinking about like what other disinformation campaigns are being run by the Chinese government, especially in the time of COVID-19. So I think that's something that we need to question and actually take a look at. So to end with, I would really want to talk about the responsibility. The responsibility of this COVID-19 mess and the pandemic doesn't only lie with the Chinese government, but with global companies, UN organizations, which have allowed China to change global norms around privacy and freedom of expression. Changing these norms have led to this global pandemic. And I think we have to hold not only China, the Chinese government accountable, but also these technology companies and international organizations accountable at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Lobsang. Our final speaker is Dorje Setin from Students for a Free Tibet.
Thank you, John. You can hear me, right, John? Okay. So what we are dealing right now is a human-made catastrophe, and we have to understand that. The global coronavirus pandemic, which started in Wuhan, China, and now spread across the world, could have been stopped if Chinese communist regime have taken the right decision on time. It could have been contained if the Chinese government has not punished the whistleblower lawyers, doctors like Li Wenyang and others who were punished because they spoke up the truth and they tried to save people's life. And it is unfortunate now that whole world is paying the cost of the Chinese government repressive rule and repressive policy that they have been carrying out throughout the year. As some of our colleagues mentioned here, how the censorship and surveillance has affected, and this is not what we are seeing right now in regard to Tibetans and the Uyghurs and Chinese democracy activists. These are not a new thing, but the international community, whole world is now facing it in their face, like the challenge and paying the cost of for not speaking up for the rights of people in China, in Tibet, and in Uzbekistan. Even now, like China is trying to spread the disinformation and try to censor the voice of people and the cautions of people being critical of the mishandling of the Chinese government on coronavirus situation. So what I believe right now for the international community and world government, it is important to hear the voices of human rights activists on the ground, the voices of people on the ground, and it is important to hear the true information rather than trusting on the Chinese government. And it is unfortunate that many medias are even now buying the propaganda of Chinese government. And it is also important for the international community to make World Health Organization accountable and also caution for supporting the Chinese government propaganda. And in doing so, World Health Organization is failing its own mission for protecting the lives of people. As much as we believe in, as a global citizen, as much as we believe in international community need to work together during this crisis, but we cannot let Chinese government away. We need to make the Chinese government accountable for the crisis, for the global crisis. And we need to make sure Xi Jinping doesn't change the narrative of the global pandemic just to protect his power and glory and his authority. So it is an urgent issue, and we are here to speak. And what I want to say at the end is, it is important to hear the voice of people. And in these panelists, we can see who are expressing the facts that is facing on the ground in Tibet, in East Turkestan, and by the Chinese activists as well. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Dorji Setin, and thank you to everyone on our panel for those excellent opening remarks. We've been receiving some questions during those presentations. Thanks to those who've sent questions so far. Please keep them coming. You can post questions in the chat box and we will look out for them. I'm going to start with a question maybe for Yachu, which is, it is well known that China manipulates information and abuse human rights. So why are governments and other international organizations like the WHO so quick to trust the situation in China?
That's actually a very good question, because everybody's wondering why we all know the human rights violations the Chinese government has committed. Why reputable international organizations sing the praises of the Chinese government. I think it has a lot to do with the structure and the fundings of how of the international institutions. For example, WHO. I mean, it's part of the UN, but its funding, it receives money from major governments. The biggest donor is the US government, and also it receives money from private foundations. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a big donor of the WHO. So the WHO has always been in a situation that it's perpetually looking for funding. So the US government has been, threatening to defund or, reduce the amount of money contributed to the WHO. So the WHO, is looking for new sources, and the Chinese government has been increasing its amount given to WHO. So that is a big incentive for the leadership of WHO to be very cozy with the Chinese government. On the other hand, I think, which is also very important, is how the leadership is elected in the first place. The WHO is elected by a group within the WHO called the World Health Assembly, the WHO, and the WHO elects the head of the WHO, the Director General. And this person, the Chinese government has been working on to get this person elected for years. It's not the current. Not only the current one, the previous one, which is a Hong Kong bureaucrat. So them getting elected in the first place has a lot to do with the Chinese government's help. So of course, when you get elected, you wanted to pay back of what the government has been doing for you. So they have been speaking very friendly and say a lot of good things about Chinese government's response to the COVID-19.
That's great. Thanks, Yasho. The next question is, can you explain how China stops access to Tibet and Uyghur regions, and why it's so worrying in this current situation? And maybe Kinsom, you'd like to make a start with that?
Sure. So yes, the issue of access is very important when it comes to Tibet and East Turkestan, because to witness the full extent of what China is doing in these places, people need access, people need information. And right now, for the last 10 years or more than that, China has literally shut Tibet off, or for that matter, East Turkestan, from the international community. And journalists, foreign diplomats, including the UN, independent UN observers, as well as ordinary tourists. Many of you may not know that, as an ordinary tourist from a foreign country, you cannot go to Tibet just as you would go to any other country, such as Japan or any part of Asia. Now, of course, you can go under very, very limited freedom. You have to be part of a supervised group. You have to be part of a tour group, which is, supervised and controlled when you are in Tibet. So there is very limited opportunity to interact with the local population in Tibet and get a real understanding of what is happening there. And so this is especially troubling in a situation like this, in a pandemic, in a serious crisis like this. It is very difficult to get the full information, which is why when the crisis has been unfolding in China, in Tibet, across the world, there is very little information about the exact number of the coronavirus cases that have been coming out from Tibet. And as a result, so we are in this situation where we don't know what is really happening to the Tibetan people inside Tibet. And which is why countries around the world have been pushing for something called reciprocal access to Tibet. Just as Chinese government officials, journalists, and citizens can come to our part of the world, to our free and democratic countries and access all our places and institutions freely without any restrictions, that same level of access must be granted to our diplomats, to our journalists, to our citizens. Because reciprocity is such a fundamental principle, in a diplomatic relationship between two countries. The US Congress and the government has set a strong precedent in this regard. And now it is up to other countries around the world, the UK, Canada, Australia, everywhere, to come up with such a legislation.
Thanks, Kim Song. Zumratai, perhaps you'd like to add something from a Uyghur perspective.
Yes, thank you, John. So as Kinzum mentioned it, I think the access even before this crisis was very difficult and limited. Before this pandemic broke out, we knew very little about what was happening, and from the very little we knew, it was mostly foreign reporters who would sometimes be able to report on the situation in these regions, both Tibet and East Turkestan. But since the outbreak, obviously, it was worrying. It's worrying because of the camps. This is one of the main issues. We don't know what's happening inside. We know that the conditions are the hygiene and sanitation conditions are very poor inside. So this is worrying for us. If we did find out that the outbreak broke into 500 prisons outside of the Uyghur region, that might have happened inside East Turkestan, but we just have no information on that, no access whatsoever. And even communicating with family, it's very difficult. So especially with the expulsion of foreign journalists that happened a month ago, that was kind of that added to the fuel. And the situation concerning the virus, especially, we had reports, very limited reports, but our RFA was was at the forefront of reporting on the coronavirus situation in East Turkestan. And from videos that were shared on Chinese social media, we've seen that there were food shortages because Chinese authorities, they did not warn the people in the Uyghur region in advance for the quarantine. So people were not able to get enough supplies, and there were very repressive policies that were implemented and regulations. So people going outside, there were very harsh punishments. So that's especially worrying, but also the mass transfers of Uyghur workers when the pandemic was happening, like throughout China. So China sent thousands of Uyghur workers to southern parts of China. So this shows that how they completely disregarded Uyghur lives. And so this is a very worrying situation, but also like treating this virus as a state secret, that actually shows China's and the the Communist Party's intentions behind this. And like my colleague mentioned it too, we've been pushing for unfettered access to the region before even this crisis happened. So especially at the Human Rights Council, the High Commissioner, actually China proposed to High Commissioner and welcomed a visit to East Turkestan, and the High Commissioner welcomed this decision. But then recently, China is trying to deflect this again, and they've been saying that this has become a political decision, and it's been politicized by different UN bodies and by activists and governments. So it will be interesting to see, because now we're even more pushing to have unfettered access to East Turkestan. But this is also very important for Tibet as well, because these regions are so remote and like so tightly controlled that I think we have to push even further. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks both. Did anyone else have anything to add to that question? Otherwise, we can move to the next one. Okay. So the next question is, in the West, there is widespread concern about the situation in prisons. Is there a concern about prisoners held by China, specifically political prisoners? Do you think this could result in changes to the Chinese Communist Party? Maybe Tong Gao, you'd like to address this one?
Okay. So there are some reports that prisoners in China have been affected in Shandong province, Zhejiang, and Hubei province, and only in Wuhan city, reportedly more than 2,000, nearly 2,000 prisoners affected the coronavirus. But because of the control of media, because of the tight censorship on internet, I believe many such affections in prison are not reported, and this issue was not discussed sufficiently in China, especially the political prisoners. I think in China it was strictly forbidden to talk about political prisoners. Their names are banned. Their stories are totally banned by official media, and even on internet and social media, the discussion of any political prisoner is censored. This coronavirus will not change the Communist Party. They won't give more space for civil society. They won't ease their censorship, and they won't go towards liberal democracy. To the contrary, they use the COVID-19 to tighten this control, to prioritize the social stability. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Did anyone else have anything to add? That's cool. I think that's a comprehensive answer. The next one's about surveillance. So this is one for you, I think, Lobsang. I've heard about Beijing's dystopian system of surveillance. How is this used now, and has this increased since the coronavirus situation has come about?
Thanks, John. Yeah, so this kind of like, there is a huge debate about this whole space, right? And I think that's important to recognize, because especially during this time of pandemic, right, China has implemented something called the contact apps, tracing apps, where you kind of look at who might have suffered from an app, and then kind of looking at location data and a lot of other data to figure out whether you might be susceptible or whether you might have contacted coronavirus in that regard. So this is something that has expanded on top of the surveillance. So whether it's through like some of the facial recognition softwares and everything that's already there. So the question now becomes like, this is the surveillance that was pervasive in East Turkestan and Tibetan areas has been very pervasive and has been there for a very long time. However, now it has shifted into the common Chinese citizen. And the question becomes, people are already using these apps, so people trust the government to use these apps and kind of like want to, in some ways, be safe, right? And so it's kind of like the question is like, this is an app that's part of like a Trojan horse that's already in your system. Why would the government want to take it away? Why would they want you to have that privacy back? So I think that's a question that is a really important aspect of what will be the situation for a common Chinese citizen after this pandemic. What will be the other reasons why the Chinese government can always kind of say, well, we need some of like apps like these to surveil you so that we can better protect you. And since they have protected the Chinese people, especially during this time of pandemic, why would they stop the government from using it? So I think there are certain fundamental issues of like surveillance that is going to come up in the later part of the year, especially after this pandemic is over. And not only for China. South Korea is one example where this has been used widely. And there are a number of other countries which have started to use it without naming countries, but there are a number of government sanctioned apps which have not undergone any scrutiny. There's not a number of policies in place where how these apps are being scrutinized. So I think that's a big question that goes beyond China as well.
Thanks, Losang. Anyone else? Okay. Otherwise, the next question is: Have the UN Human Rights Council done anything specific on this issue so far? I think I'll go to Zumratai first for this one.
Thank you, John. So I've been kind of following what was happening at the Human Rights Council. Obviously, it was suspended towards the end of the council because of the coronavirus situation. So the latest update is, so they will hold a online information session on Thursday, and they've invited NGOs and actors from civil society to participate into this. And actually it will be on coronavirus and its implications to human rights in human rights. So it will be interesting to see. We've submitted obviously questions through our respective NGOs on how China is reacting to this and Chinese propaganda. But this week we've also learned that, actually last week we've learned that China was appointed by the Human Rights Council to a Human Rights Council panel where it plays a key role in picking the world's body's human rights investigators, including special procedures, special rapporteurs, which are key component of the special procedures. And it is especially important for human rights activists like us, because they are independent experts who are chosen for thematic issues or country by country. And for us, it is absolutely absurd that China, a country that is currently committing crimes against humanity and human rights violations against Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, etc. This is, and undermining especially the concept of human rights in the UN, continues to not only gain importance in the United Nations, but they're also compromising our democratic values, our human rights values, and they're redefining human rights inside the UN. So this leaves very little space for human rights activists like us to work and make our voices heard inside the UN, which is basically a platform that is very essential for activists like us.
Great, thanks. Did anyone else have anything to add to that one? Okay, thanks, Umratai. The next question is from Alison in the UK. When the crisis starts to abate, which countries do you think may be willing to show leadership in forging this new future of compassion and honesty and hold China to account? Should we go first to Yachou?
I'm not sure about showing leadership. Try to be the honest and compassionate leader. But the U.S. government has been trying to hold the Chinese government accountable. I mean, on the one hand, China should be blamed for, causing this situation because it missed several weeks of a critical window to contain the situation in China through censorship. But on the other hand, the U.S. government, is trying to shift the blame on China because of its own failure. Some U.S. legislators in Congress are trying to draft and pass bills to, hold China accountable for its initial responses and cover up. So this is what's going on in the U.S.
Thanks, Yachou. Does anyone else want to say something about this?
Yeah, I may add a little bit in a broader way. The coronavirus is influencing the international economic and geopolitics very deeply. Many countries, I think more and more countries realize the threat from Chinese government to international human rights and freedom and public health. But I feel there's a long way to go to give up the so-called engagement policy. The Western countries that are really reluctant to anger Chinese government, they still see China as a very powerful country, and they have wasteful thinking maybe that China can go to open society through the market reform and globalization, and most importantly, the interest. So the Western countries and the world don't want to give up the interest, the chance to earn money from Chinese market. So I think they have some new policies, some examination of the engagement policy, but it's still hard to have a totally new policy.
Thanks, Tongbiao. And Jinzong, I see that you've unmuted yourself. So would you like to say something as well?
Sure, just to add briefly to this, now a crisis that had originated in China, has now become a global crisis. So, a crisis of such nature needs global cooperation. And, to answer to that question on who can take a leadership role in this, it's really up to all of us, up to the international community, up to every one of us to come together and find a united solution to this problem. Especially, the biggest problem, apart from, of course, the economic and the health and the social upheaval that this crisis has resulted in, one big problem that this crisis has brought about is how an authoritarian government, a brutal, authoritarian, irresponsible, dishonest government like China is now emerging, in the eyes of many as this benevolent, responsible world leader. And this pivot, this shift in thinking, that must be challenged. And to challenge that, all of us are responsible. All the, especially the leading Western democracies have to really come together and really protect, resist this from happening. So yes, I would really urge, everyone to come together to, take a united position on this and together resist, what China is doing, to the whole world.
Thanks, Kim Zom, and also to Yacho and Tong Biao for your answers there. We've got so many questions coming, so sorry if you haven't heard your one yet. The next question comes from India, from Jyotsna. My apologies if I've pronounced your name incorrectly. And the question is, are there other mechanisms to track infected or quarantined citizens without breaching data privacy? How does one ensure a robust and effective containment strategy for COVID without resorting to surveillance as the easy option? Lobsang, I think that's one for you.
Sure. Thanks, John. Thanks, Jyotsna. So I think one question I think we need to ask is when people talk about contact tracing apps, it's also understand the reliability of those, because it looks at the location data and the kind of the granularity that is needed to do contact tracing is not as great, especially in bigger cities. So I think kind of thinking about the fact that some of these contact tracing apps are great and they can actually do what the full surveillance and give you all the information is also a bit of a myth. In terms of what else can be done, it is a really important question and it's also very challenging. So I know folks who are doing some work and I don't think there's anything right now there. However, one of my colleagues, Nathan, who many of you might know from the Guardian Project, has been working on a project called the Spotlight, which is looking at how do you get data for a union. So as a union, so the time that you're working, all the data that you are kind of keeping on your phone and your app. So you have all the data that you may need, especially as a union, to prove how many hours you have worked and stuff like that. And the next question is, how does that data get shared cryptographically and in a private way? So I think there are challenges. And just to let people know, there are groups on the internet freedom space, on a lot of university space, who are working towards this. However, I don't know of a solution that is there right now, but also the fact that thinking that contact tracing apps is the solution is also a myth.
Thank you, Lobsang. We're running out of time, so we're going to ask 2 more questions, and I'm really sorry to anyone who hasn't heard their question. There might be other ways for us to address it in the near future. The next one is from Thomas, and it says, "Dear panelists, how may China's propaganda regarding the coronavirus most effectively be countered?" And Georgie Seton, would you like to answer that one?
Yep. Thank you, John. Sorry, my my connection is breaking, so if I miss in the middle, and anyone else can join. So I think that is the most important question now, how we can challenge China propaganda. I think it is very important to understand for the global community. First, as we blame China right now, Chinese communist regime, we also have to blame ourselves. Our failed policy has led us to what we are right now. Opening of China to the world economy and world market has completely failed what we had imagined China to open up, and slowly there will be an open society, democracy will come to China, has completely failed. And we have to acknowledge that this past 30 years of policy of engagement with China has completely failed, and that need to be now relooked and re-engage China, how we can re-engage China. Most important right now, with so much misleading information Chinese government is sending, it is important to hear the voice of activists on the ground. It is important to hear the voice of Tibetan people inside Tibet, people in East Turkestan, and the people in China who are critical of Chinese government mishandling of all the situation. It is unfortunate that even now we are seeing how media and the corporation and companies continue to follow Chinese government information, but we must know that in the long run, it will not pay back. It's a lost investment. So it is important now, as people are becoming more conscious now, people are becoming more careful, especially in terms of economy, how coronavirus has globally affected the economy. In a long-term investment, we have to understand China is now no longer a place where you can, bid your future for the investment. I think investment need to be changed. We are hearing news that now India and many other Asian places, other countries the companies are moving towards those countries. And I think that is really important move. And also it relates to the global leadership, which we are missing right now, the role of Taiwan, this small island of 21 million people. As of now, I think they had less than 400 cases of coronavirus, has shown a tremendous kind of leadership in the world, but this country is not being recognized by World Health Organization and other countries because of China's propaganda and influence. I think it is important to recognize Taiwan's role and how it can show further global leadership. It has already shown the leadership. I think the best way to counter China propaganda is how we can support Taiwan, Hong Kong, people's movement in Tibet and in East Turkestan, and the Chinese democracy, the voices that has been suppressed by Chinese government throughout the decades. So I think that way we will be able to counter China, the propaganda, I think so.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dorji Tetin. Right. There was one last question which was asking about protests across China, but I think I'd actually like to expand this and just put this to you as a group. What action do you think that all of us can take to push back against this situation? What would be beneficial for Chinese citizens, Tibetans and Uyghurs? And rather than picking on one of you, I'm going to just ask you as a group, and whoever wants to tell me can go first.
I think I'm going to start. You know, I'm a researcher for Human Rights Watch. So my job is to uncover human rights abuses in China. You know, Dorji was mentioning that, you know, how we counter Chinese propaganda is by providing the truth. You know, for me, you know, trying to speak to people in China who are suffering from the government's measures, not only, you know, the people who are affected, who are infected with the virus, also people who are, you know, suffering as a result of the Chinese government's draconian measures. So to me personally, it's just to do a better job to uncover the abuses, the sufferings going on in China.
I can maybe quickly add something. So for me, as an activist, and I mean, I kind of do pretty much everything, research and, you know, at the forefront of protest. But I often get this comment of, or question about whether I am not worried about my relatives back in East Turkestan because of my involvement. And I always say, I am, of course, but at the same time, a lot of Uyghurs in the diaspora, before the camps emerged, a lot of us, we chose to remain silent and not speak up because we were worried about our relatives. But then what the camps has proven is that our silence does not guarantee anything, does not guarantee safety for these people back home, whether it is in East Turkestan, whether it is in Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong, wherever it is, your silence will not help the people in mainland China. So I think for us, especially for the Uyghur movement, is the silver lining with the camps is that it kind of brought all of the Uyghurs in the diaspora community together, and we all chose to speak up and condemn China and Chinese repressive policies, and that actually led to the attention of the international community on the situation. And now you can go outside and ask 10 people about Uyghurs or East Turkestan, and I guarantee you that 8 out of the 10 of these people will know about the situation, or will at least have heard about it. So I think that silence is not an option in these critical times. We must choose international fora. We must, we must be present in all these platforms and engage with private sectors, public sectors, and make our voice heard.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to add one thing. Was the fact is we're looking at like, for example, the Chinese government, right, and holding them accountable is really important. However, at the same time, as I was saying earlier, there are a number of international organizations, technology companies, others who are actually responsible for implementing a lot of these policies and kind of changing the global norms. So I think we need to start holding them accountable. And one example that I just want to share is the Apple campaign that Tibet Action Institute, Students for Free Tibet, Tibet Network, and a lot of other groups have worked on, especially kind of like trying to get some freedom of expression as part of the Apple Charter, right? So I think movement like those are really important, because to hold some of these technology companies accountable actually makes sure that they can't do what they do in China, and that actually gives, I don't know, like, I guess it's in a way, I just want to say that we just want to hold like not only the Chinese government accountable, but the pillars which are actually making China like stand up there, right? So whether it's WHO, it's the UN Human Rights Council, which just did what Zumrata you just spoke about. So I think those organizations and those companies are something that we also need to hold accountable and kind of do more campaigns around those as well.
Yeah. So I think that there are many things we can do. For example, calling for attention to the situation of Tibetans, Uyghurs, and the detained Chinese political prisoners and the citizen journalists. We know that many people were calling for the designation of the president of WHO. So we should give pressure to international community to realize that the role of WHO in this coronavirus is really in favor of public health, and also Taiwan should be adopted as a member of WHO. And another thing is to hold Chinese government and Chinese leaders accountable because of their cover up and mishandling. Yeah.
So yes, I want to support what our colleague Zumrete just mentioned, about reiterate the importance of speaking up. Silence is not an option. I know, in the current context, a lot of people are, being very cautious about not saying the wrong thing. And I know that is, kind of playing into the Chinese government's hands. It is, there is a lot of xenophobia in many countries around the world. And, racism against anybody in any form is wrong, and that must be opposed. But then at the same time, we cannot, stop ourselves from challenging or questioning the Chinese government. And I think, a lot of us are getting caught up in this kind of being very politically correct. And that is not an option for us. That is not an option for us right now. Everybody must speak up. And when this crisis is over, and whenever that is, we simply cannot go back to business as usual with China. There has to be a whole new re-engagement with China, whole new review of what our relationship will look like. So and the first step to making this happen is to speak up, speak your mind, and yes.
Thanks, everyone. And I strongly support all the statements made by the colleague here. I think this is an important question for us as a movement leader. I'm an activist. I work with Tibetans on the ground. I think every challenge brings opportunity. And even though this is a challenging moment for all of us, it's a huge opportunity. If you try to imagine 3 years ago when Xi Jinping was changing the constitution and Xi Jinping was coming up with all this plan of the Baylin Road initiative, it was a whole different time. Right now, even though we see China further trying to use the propaganda and silencing, we also need to acknowledge and understand that China is trying to face, trying to save their face. Xi Jinping is basically trying to, keep the control that he wants to, but it is losing. We know that, and the Chinese Communist, regime has acknowledged that this is the biggest crisis they are facing since the formation of the Chinese Communist regime. And I really truly support what Dokul Issa, the president of World Uyghur Congress, when he was in New York recently in February, we had a panel of Tibetans and Uyghurs and Hong Kongers and Taiwanese and Chinese democracy activists. And he said that even though we are concerned about the coronavirus, but CCP, Chinese Communist regime, is the biggest virus that has killed millions of people, Chinese, Tibetans, and Uyghurs. And we need to understand that as long as this virus is there, there will be crisis. And now world is facing it. So I think it is an opportunity as well. And we as a movement leader, we really need to reconnect with the people on the ground. As far as my knowledge, we also had a concern in Tibet where, because of China's propaganda, there was a time that people were believing that, oh, Xi Jinping's crackdown, so-called crackdown on the corruption, he is a good leader. But now people are realizing it. People are really thinking again, and it is being affected in the Chinese people as well. There was a protest in Wuhan recently. So you can see the crisis that we are seeing. So I think this is an opportunity, and we need to also have the vision, and we need to be bold enough to think that this will be the last one. This will the end of the Chinese CCP. So are we ready to, to be with our people on the ground to really, form a new society? I think this is a big question, and I think we need to be courage enough to think that far. And of course, these are something that we believe, but on the ground, we have to act, we have to be strong, and we have to believe in ourselves. And together we can definitely win this war against the CCP's, the occupation and the repression that has been going on throughout the decades. I think this is their time now.
Thanks, Dorji Seton. That's a great place to end today's discussion. I really want to thank everyone who took the time to watch the discussion today. Thank you to those of you who've been asking questions and sharing the live stream, and apologies again to those of you who asked questions that we couldn't fit in. And I really want to thank our excellent panel as well. Dr. Tong Biao, Kin Song Dongju, Zumratay Akin, Yacho Wang, Lobsang Gyatso, and Dorji Seton. And I'd also like to thank Mandy McEwen and the Tibet Network for convening this discussion. I hope it's been useful. It's been a privilege to speak to you today. Goodbye from all of us, and stay safe.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.